What's up guys, the Strong Boys 19 here. This is going to be another album review for a new 2021 album, and this did come off as a very big surprise, but this album just immediately popped up out of the blue, and it was announced like a few days before the release of this record. And what this thing is another new Limp Bizkit album. A new Limp Bizkit album entitled Still Sucks. Now this is the latest full-length album in Limp Bizkit's discography, their 6th album to be released, following up one of the worst records of 2011, which is a decade prior to this album, of Gold Cobra. Now I'll have to be very brutally frank here. I thought when I was diving into music that Limp Bizkit were, dare I say it, a bit of a guilty pleasure of mine. But then over time, when I have been listening to many different metal bands in any virtuoso, artistic, and a variety of genres, and even ones outside of metal, Limp Bizkit's reputation for me had been in the disconnecting and derailing mark of music. And what's even the worst part is that as much as I really do admire to listen to these musicians, Wes Borland, Sam Rivers, John Otto, even DJ Lethal, with their very rhythmic, catchy, and quite an addictive amount of material, of instrumentation, especially with albums like with Significant Other, to Chocolate Starfish and the Hot Dog Flavored Water. By the way, one of the worst album titles of all time. But unfortunately, obviously, the band does get a lot of the dismissive and outright hate, not only into the sound of the band, but of the notorious Fred Durst. That is instantly the main problem that I have with this band. As much as I really do admire and absorb a lot of the many different hits from Limp Bizkit, Fred Durst does come into fruition, into this sound that totally destroys what I like about the band as a whole. And with that being said, out of the way, as brutally honest as I really am with this review already, right here, the first album in a decade, their shortest album, over 30 minutes in length, and the return into the original lineup, like with Gold Cobra. And unfortunately, it's just going to be very cliche, but I'll just go dive into this, that this album is easily one of the worst things that I've heard of 21. Let's just go into the instrumentation points. Some of the instrumentation parts outside of Fred's antics of lyrics, there were some occasional riffs from Wes Borland that I thought were pretty passable, like on the opening track of Out of Style, which does remind me on a bit of like a Tom Morello, Rage Against the Machine kind of aesthetic approach onto his riffs, and also with the second track, Dirty Rotten Biscuit. Though I will say that as much as I do give the musicianship on Limp Bizkit a lot of credit, I do find that Wes Borland is one of the most adventurous and a directly inspired way of a guitar player, and especially onto John Otto's rhythmic drumming and Sam's prominent bass lines, and even DJ Lethal's way of sampling and turntables. With some of the first half of the album, they do decide to go in various directions in experimentalism, as like a return back into that hip-hop kind of vein, as there were tracks occasionally that you would hear like a hip-hop beat. But when it comes to the originality of this album, this is really almost the downward spiral as the worst Limp Bizkit album. It's incredibly inconsistent without anything memorable of a hook, and I really did not find anything all that well delivered whatsoever. But what's also the thing is that I completely understand that Westmoreland did find this album very difficult to make, and I appreciate him for that. And as the band, as Wes did say, that they've made over 30 tracks, and most of the time it's just all down to Fred Durst with either writing the lyrics and adding them into the songs, or just scrapping them after scrapping them after scrapping them, making this the most difficult album to make in any Limp Bizkit form of albums. This could have been, for me, the weakest Limp Bizkit album for lyrical content, but I will say that it has to go to Results May Vary, which to me is the band's worst album. But this record, with the way its direction goes, does not solidify without anything worth original. The other issues I have onto the record is mainly through onto the second half, including some of the tracks like Love the Hate, which is just absolutely one of the cringiest parts of the record. It's lyrically basically like a parody of people hating on Limp Bizkit, and on the second verse just whines that they complain about Fred Durst. But the way these types of disses and similes were written, they were just so bland. And also another problematic one for lyricism goes, Snacky Poo, which to me does contain one of Durst's weakest lyrics, especially on some of the lines like, lately I've been snappy, I gave up on the fitheads, sometimes up on a bucket, eventually I kick it, chocolate starfish, everybody kiss it, I pray that you don't get it, that I ain't even religious, I don't need your Insta, referencing Instagram obviously, and I don't want your digits, hit somebody else up when you're trying to sell tickets, goodbye. When it goes into some more of the sad, sappy kind of acoustic imagery, and the instrumentation on this final track does for me make me think that an Ed Sheeran album or project could be really acceptable and as efficient with the way it sounds. And when it comes to some of the other instrumental passages, like Pill Popper for example, I think that one is more or less onto a heavier approach, and I think that this instrumental direction is like the only passable mark of the record. Does make me think and imagine that maybe Trent Reznor of Nine Inch Nails fame would add something with this type of instrumental passageway, or even like on a Marilyn Manson record. Turn It Up Bitch could have been involved in like the first couple of Cypress Hill records, especially with the looping bass line, like on the Cypress Hill track of I Ain't Going Out Like That. Don't Change is the song where it's like so boring and just as uninspired, but yet alone it is an Inks cover. The song from a band from the 80s in that new wave spectrum, and don't get me started about one of the worst covers of all time of Limp Bizkit, with such an atrocious insult to injury to the eardrums of the Who's Behind Blue Eyes. I always despise that with a burning passion of my being. But overall, I find that most of the material is so out of balance and downward spiral, uninventive, and forgettably awful material. It's just as ironic with this album's title, yet alone, as I said earlier, I really appreciate the musicianship with the band outside of Fred Durst. So I give the admiration and attempts that they wanted to make this record done as possible, but I find that this record is, just without question, not at all a big improvement. I'm going to give this record Still Sucks by Limp Bizkit. I was originally going to give the album my rating of a 1 out of 10, but the more I thought about it after editing, I would decide to give this album a 2 out of 10. Mainly because I think that the production on the album was pretty decent, and I thought some of the instrumentation on the first couple of tracks
and even on Pill Popper, as I've mentioned earlier in the review, to really have something more inspired, but this one was really not worth it to make itself stand out as much.
I have heard worse albums, and this is going to be very obvious if I would put this as the worst album of the year, but it's not going to be the worst album of the year. Yet I know it will be just as annoyingly cliche and typical, but it had to be said with what I wanted to find something of maybe an improvement that could defeat the awfulness of Gold Cobra, and the results made very vivid, gross, and disgusting mark of that album's material, but Still Sucks does not deliver whatsoever. I am curious to know what you guys personally think of this album in the comments down below. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll keep you guys posted for more videos in the near future.